The sun hung like a burning coin in the merciless sky, beating down upon the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge. It was the kind of heat that made the wooden boards of the sidewalks crack and groan, the kind that turned the distant mountains into shimmering mirages. The red rocks that bordered the settlement glowed like hot coals, and the sparse patches of sage and mesquite offered no relief from the blazing afternoon. Despite the harsh conditions, or perhaps in defiance of them, the town had dressed itself in whatever finery it could muster. Ribbons of faded blue and white cloth hung from the posts of the general store, and someone had swept the dust from the steps of the small wooden church at the end of the main street. It was a wedding day, and in this unforgiving land, such occasions demanded celebration, no matter how modest. Inside the church, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison stood before the altar, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers that her younger sister had gathered from the creek bed that morning. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that seemed almost out of place in this rough country auburn hair that caught the light filtering through the single stained glass window, green eyes that held both hope and uncertainty, and delicate features that spoke of her Eastern upbringing. Her wedding dress, carefully preserved from her late mother's own ceremony, had yellowed slightly with age, but the intricate lacework remained intact. She had spent hours the night before, working by candlelight to mend a small tear in the hem, her fingers moving with the same determination that had brought her family west 3 years ago. Beside her stood Thomas McKenna, tall and broad-shouldered, his face already weathered by 25 years under the western sun. He was a good man, everyone said so, owned a small but promising cattle ranch 5 miles north of town, had built a sturdy cabin with his own hands, and had courted Sarah with patient persistence for the better part of a year. His hands, rough from years of ranch work, held hers gently as Reverend Phillips read from the worn Bible. The congregation was small but earnest, perhaps 30 souls who had braved the heat to witness the union. Sarah's father, Samuel Morrison, sat in the front pew, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He had worried about his daughter in this wild land, had questioned his decision to leave Pennsylvania after his wife's death, but seeing her now, radiant despite the perspiration beading on her forehead, he allowed himself a moment of peace. Yet, beneath the joy, an undercurrent of tension ran through the assembly like a barely audible discord in a familiar hymn. Men shifted uncomfortably in their seats, hands unconsciously moving to check the placement of rifles propped against the pews. Women clutched their children a little tighter, eyes occasionally darting to the windows. The Apache had been active in recent months, raids on outlying ranches, horses stolen, supplies taken. Just 2 weeks prior, the Hendricks family had lost their barn to fire arrows. "Do you, Sarah Elizabeth, take this man?" Reverend Phillips's voice carried on, steady and reassuring, but even he couldn't entirely mask the worry that creased his brow. The town had posted lookouts on the ridge, young Billy Watson and the Caraway twins, but everyone knew that if the Apache truly wanted to strike, there would be little warning. Sarah's voice was clear as she spoke her vows, though her heart raced with more than just wedding day nerves. She had heard the stories, whispered among the women at the Tuesday sewing circle, tales of settlements burned, of families torn apart, of women taken. She pushed these thoughts aside, focusing on Thomas's steady blue eyes, on the promise of the life they would build together. The ceremony was drawing to a close when the first cry went up from outside. It was a sound that every person in that church had learned to dread, the high, ululating war cry that seemed to come from the very rocks and wind itself. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The congregation, frozen in a tableau of celebration, turned to terror. Then chaos erupted. The doors of the church burst open, and Billy Watson stumbled in, his face white with fear, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Apache!" he gasped. Coming fast from the North Ridge. The transformation was instantaneous. Men grabbed their rifles, women gathered children, and Reverend Phillips's Bible hit the floor with a thud that seemed to echo like thunder. Thomas pushed Sarah behind him, reaching for the Colt revolver he had foolishly left at the cabin, thinking it improper to bring to his own wedding. Through the windows came the thunder of hooves, the crack of rifles, and more of those terrible cries. The Apache warriors swept into Cedar Ridge like a desert storm, their painted faces fierce in the afternoon sun. They rode with a skill that made them seem one with their horses, firing arrows and rifles with deadly accuracy. Sarah watched in horror as the peaceful scene disintegrated. "Mr." Henderson fell in the doorway, an arrow protruding from his shoulder. Women screamed. Men shouted orders that no one could hear above the din. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, acrid and choking. And then she saw him. He rode a black horse with white markings, and unlike the others, he seemed unhurried, almost contemplative in his movements. His face was painted in bold strokes of red and black, but his eyes, dark and penetrating, swept the scene with calculated purpose. He was tall for an Apache, lean and powerful, with the bearing of one accustomed to command. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and across his chest, she could see the scars of many battles. Their eyes met across the chaos, and something passed between them. Not recognition, for they had never met, but something else. Something that made Sarah's blood run cold. He raised his rifle. Not to fire, but to point directly at her. Thomas tried to shield her, pushing her toward the back door of the church. But the warriors were already circling the building. The defensive line the townsmen had tried to form crumbled under the swift assault. In the confusion, Sarah lost sight of the warrior on the black horse, focusing instead on staying close to Thomas, on finding some way to escape. But escape was impossible. The Apache had planned well, striking when the town's defenders were gathered in one place, their weapons set aside for celebration. Within minutes that felt like hours. The resistance faltered. Bodies littered the street, some moving, some terribly still. Sarah found herself separated from Thomas in the melee. She pressed against the side wall of the church, her wedding dress now torn and stained with dirt and blood, though whether her own or another's, she couldn't tell. The bouquet of wildflowers lay trampled in the dust. Then strong hands seized her arms. She struggled, screamed Thomas's name, but the warrior who held her was immovable as stone. It was him, the one on the black horse. Up close, she could see that he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps in his late 20s, with a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw. His grip was firm but not cruel, and when she tried to bite his hand, something that might have been amusement flickered in his dark eyes. He spoke to her in Apache, words she couldn't understand, then switched to broken English. "No fight. You come." "No!" She wrenched against his hold, her eyes searching desperately for Thomas, for her father, for anyone who might help. But the battle was all but over. The surviving townspeople were either fleeing or surrendering, and she saw with growing horror that other women were being similarly taken. The warrior half carried, half dragged her to his horse. She fought him every step, her fine wedding shoes slipping in the dust, the lace of her dress catching and tearing on the rough ground. But his strength was overwhelming, and within moments she found herself lifted onto the black horse, positioned in front of him on the saddle. As they rode out of the burning town, for fires had started in several buildings, Sarah caught one last glimpse of the church. Thomas lay on the steps, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. A sob tore from her throat, and tears began to flow, mixing with the dust and sweat on her face. The warrior's arm around her waist was like an iron band, holding her securely as they galloped away from everything she had known, everything she had dreamed of just moments before. Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew smaller, the smoke from the fires rising like a monument to all that had been lost. As they rode into the vastness of the desert, toward the towering red rocks and hidden canyons that sheltered the Apache, Sarah heard the warrior speak again, this time to his companions. And though she didn't understand the words, the tone was clear, prideful, triumphant. She was his prize, his spoil of war. The words echoed in her mind like a prophecy yet to be fulfilled. Bitter and defiant, the Apache warrior took the bride as spoils, but even through her tears, even through her terror and grief, Something hard and unyielding crystallized within her. She would survive this. She would endure, and somehow, someday, she would make him pay for what he had taken from her. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. And Sarah Elizabeth Morrison? No, she realized with fresh anguish. She would never be Sarah McKenna now, rode into the unknown, a captive bride on her wedding day, the taste of dust and tears bitter in her mouth. The journey stretched before them like a nightmare painted in shades of red and gold. Sarah's body ached from the relentless pace, her muscles screaming protest with each jarring step of the horse. The warrior behind her, she refused to think of him by any other name, maintained his iron grip around her waist, his presence a constant reminder of her captivity. They rode through landscapes that seemed torn from the very depths of hell. Towering cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised in grotesque supplication to the burning sky. The ground beneath the horses' hooves alternated between hard-packed earth that sent up clouds of choking dust and treacherous patches of loose stone that threatened to send both rider and mount tumbling into the ravines below. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent shades of crimson, Sarah became aware of her physical discomfort with acute clarity. Her wedding dress, once pristine white, was now a tattered remnant, stained with sweat, blood, and the red dust that seemed to permeate everything in this forsaken land. The corset, which had seemed merely uncomfortable during the ceremony, now felt like a torture device, constricting her breathing with each movement of the horse. The other warriors rode in formation around them, perhaps 20 in all, their faces still painted for war. She caught glimpses of other captives. She recognized Mrs. Henley, the baker's wife, slumped forward on a paint horse, and young Mary Parker, who couldn't have been more than 16, her face streaked with tears. The sight of them offered no comfort. If anything, it deepened her despair. As darkness began to fall, they made camp in a natural bowl formed by towering red rocks. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, some tending to the horses while others built small fires that would be invisible from any distance. Sarah was pulled from the horse and her legs, numb from hours of riding, buckled beneath her. She would have fallen, but the warrior caught her arm, steadying her with surprising gentleness. He spoke to her again in that mixture of Apache and broken English. "Sit, rest." He pointed to a flat rock near one of the fires. Sarah wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain some semblance of defiance, but exhaustion won. She sank onto the rock, acutely aware of every pair of eyes upon her. The warrior brought her water in a leather pouch, and though her pride screamed against accepting anything from him, her parched throat won the battle. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was the most welcome thing she had experienced since the attack. As she drank, she studied her captor surreptitiously. In the firelight, she could see more details of his appearance. The scar on his face was old but deep. Speaking of violence survived, his hands, though rough, bore the calluses of a warrior, not unlike the ranch hands she had known. Yet there was a grace to his movements that spoke of deadly skill. He wore traditional Apache dress, a breechcloth and leggings, with a cotton shirt traded from Mexicans or taken in some raid. Around his neck hung a leather pouch decorated with beadwork. He noticed her scrutiny and met her gaze directly. For a moment, neither looked away. Then he spoke, his voice low. "I'm Naichi. You understand?" Sarah remained silent, turning her face away. She would not give him the satisfaction of a response. A flash of something, anger, frustration, crossed his features, but he said nothing more, moving away to speak with the other warriors. She watched as they deferred to him, noting his position of authority. Not just a warrior, then, but a leader of some kind. As the meager meal of dried meat and corn cakes was distributed, Sarah's mind raced. She had to escape, but how? They were miles from anywhere she recognized, surrounded by armed warriors in terrain that would kill her as surely as any Apache arrow if she tried to flee unprepared. Still, she began to observe, to plan. Which warriors seemed less vigilant? Which direction had they come from? Where were the horses tethered? Her observations were interrupted when Naichi returned, bringing food. She wanted to refuse it, but survival instinct prevailed. She needed strength if she was to have any hope of escape. The dried meat was tough and salty, the corn cake gritty, but she forced herself to eat. As she ate, she became aware of a discussion among the warriors. Though she couldn't understand the words, the tones were clear. Some seemed to be arguing about the captives. One warrior, shorter and stockier than Naichi, with cruel eyes and a mouth twisted in a permanent sneer, gestured repeatedly at the women. Naichi's responses were sharp, authoritative. Whatever was being discussed, he was laying down the law. When the meal was finished, blankets were distributed. Sarah was given one that smelled of horse and smoke. She watched as the other captives were secured for the night, not cruelly, but efficiently, with rawhide bonds that would prevent escape without causing injury. When Naichi approached her with similar bonds, she struck out, her fear and anger overcoming caution. Her fist connected with his shoulder, a futile blow that probably hurt her more than him. But the gesture of defiance felt necessary. He caught her wrists easily, his strength overwhelming but controlled. For a moment, they struggled, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not anger, but something more complex. "No fight," he said quietly. "No hurt you. But you run, you die. Desert kills. Understand?" She glared at him, putting all her hatred into her gaze. "I understand that you're a savage who murdered innocent people. I understand that you destroyed my life." He seemed to understand enough of her words to grasp their meaning. His jaw tightened, but he simply secured her wrists. In front of her, she noted with surprise, which would be more comfortable for sleeping than behind her back. He made sure the bonds weren't too tight, then moved away without another word. Sarah lay on the hard ground, the inadequate blanket her only protection against the surprising cold of the desert night. Above, stars wheeled in their courses, indifferent to human suffering. She could hear the soft sobs of Mary Parker somewhere in the darkness, the murmur of warriors on watch, the distant howl of coyotes. Her mind kept returning to those final moments in Cedar Ridge. Thomas falling on the church steps, her father's face in the congregation, the life she had been about to begin now shattered beyond repair. Tears came then, silent and bitter, soaking into the red earth beneath her. But as she lay there, something else began to grow alongside her grief. A cold, hard determination. She thought of the words that seemed to echo in her mind like a promise or a curse. But she broke his savage pride. She didn't know how, didn't know when, but she would survive this. She would not be broken. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she became aware of Naichi sitting nearby, keeping watch. His profile was silhouetted against the dying embers of the fire, and for a moment, she saw not a savage warrior, but a man, as alone in his own way as she was in hers. The thought disturbed her, and she pushed it away. He was the enemy. He had taken everything from her. As dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of pearl and rose, the camp stirred to life. Sarah had barely slept, her body aching and her mind too full of plans and fears for rest. The bonds were removed so she could attend to necessary matters, always under watchful eyes. Her wedding dress, already ruined, suffered further indignity as she was forced to modify it for riding, tearing away the long train and multiple petticoats that would only hinder her, before mounting up again. She caught sight of herself in the surface of a water-filled depression in the rocks. The bride of yesterday was gone. Her carefully arranged hair hung loose and tangled. Her face was sunburned and dirty, her dress a mockery of its former elegance. But her eyes still held fire. Naichi appeared beside her, and their reflections stood together for a moment in the impromptu mirror. He said something in Apache, then added in English, "Long ride today. Mountains." She turned to face him, drawing herself up to her full height despite her exhaustion. "I will never stop trying to escape," she told him, enunciating each word clearly. Never. He studied her for a long moment, and she thought she saw something like respect in his gaze. Then the mask of the warrior slipped back into place. "Then you learn," he said simply. "Desert teaches, mountains teach. You learn or you die," as he lifted her onto his horse again, beginning another day of their forced journey. Sarah held onto her defiance like a talisman. Somewhere ahead lay the Apache stronghold, but also, somehow, her destiny. The sun rose fully, setting the red rocks ablaze, and they rode on into the heart of a land as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Captor and captive bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and forbidding, holding secrets and trials she couldn't yet imagine. But Sarah Morrison, the would-be bride, the captive, the survivor, faced them with dry eyes and a heart that refused to surrender. Whatever lay ahead, she would meet it on her own terms. The Apache camp nestled in a hidden canyon, so well concealed that Sarah hadn't seen it until they were nearly upon it. Wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made of bent branches and covered with grass and hides, dotted the landscape like organic growths from the earth itself. Children ran between them, stopping to stare as the war party returned. Women emerged from their tasks, their faces a mixture of curiosity, hostility, and grim satisfaction as they saw the captives. Sarah was pulled from Naichi's horse, her legs trembling from exhaustion and the endless ride. Around her, the other captives were likewise dismounted, and she watched in growing dread as they were led away in different directions. Mary Parker reached out desperately as she passed, and Sarah caught her hand briefly before a warrior separated them. "Be strong," Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure if the girl heard her. An older woman approached, her face weathered by years of desert life, her dark eyes sharp and assessing. She spoke rapidly to Naichi in Apache, gesturing at Sarah with obvious displeasure. Sarah didn't need to understand the words to grasp the meaning. She was an unwelcome burden, another mouth to feed, a symbol of the violence that perpetuated the cycle of raids and retribution. Naichi responded with authority, and though the woman clearly disagreed, she backed down. She grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength and began leading her toward one of the Wickiups. As they walked, Sarah became acutely aware of the eyes upon her, warriors evaluating her, women judging her, children peering at her strange pale skin and red hair with frank curiosity. The interior of the Wickiup was dim and smoky, with a small fire pit in the center and sleeping areas arranged around the edges. The woman, who Sarah would later learn was called Dakea, shoved a bundle at her. Through gestures and broken English, she made it clear that Sarah was to change out of what remained of her wedding dress. The Apache clothing was practical, a simple cotton skirt and tunic, moccasins to replace her ruined shoes. As Sarah changed, she carefully palmed the small silver cross that had been sewn into the bodice of her wedding dress, a gift from her late mother. It was all she had left of her former life, and she concealed it within the folds of her new clothing. Days blended into one another in a rhythm of survival and resistance. Sarah was put to work immediately, hauling water from the stream that ran through the canyon, gathering wood, grinding corn on stone mettets until her hands were raw and bleeding. The work was backbreaking, made worse by the altitude and her unfamiliarity with the tasks. More than once she collapsed from exhaustion, only to be roughly pulled to her feet and set back to work. The other women of the camp treated her with varying degrees of hostility. Some simply ignored her, while others went out of their way to make her tasks more difficult. One young woman named Itza seemed to take particular pleasure in Sarah's struggles, often accidentally knocking over water jars Sarah had just filled or scattering the corn she had spent hours grinding. Sarah learned that Itza had been promised to Naichi before the raid, and her resentment burned hot and obvious. During one particularly cruel incident, where Itza had deliberately tripped Sarah, causing her to spill a full water jar, Sarah's temper finally snapped. She lunged at the Apache woman, and they rolled in the dust, pulling hair and scratching until warriors pulled them apart. Naichi appeared, his face thunderous. He spoke sharply to Itza, who retreated with venomous looks at Sarah. Then he turned to Sarah, and she expected punishment. Instead, he merely said, "You fight. Good. but choose battles better. It was during the evening rituals that the cultural chasm seemed widest. The Apache would gather around the central fire, sharing songs and stories that connected them to generations of ancestors. Sarah would sit at the edges, clutching her hidden cross and whispering the prayers her mother had taught her, trying to maintain some connection to her own faith and identity. One night, a warrior named Chato noticed her praying. He was one of the crueler members of the band, the one who had argued about the captives that first night. He strode over and grabbed her hands, prying them open to reveal the small cross. With a sneer, he held it up for others to see, speaking mockingly in Apache. Sarah tried to snatch it back, but he held it out of reach, laughing at her desperation. Rage and despair battled within her. This last token of her mother, her faith, about to be destroyed or discarded like everything else in her life. "Give it back," she cried, not caring that most wouldn't understand her words. "It's all I have left." Naichi's voice cut through the laughter. He spoke a single word, and Chato's amusement died. A tense exchange followed, and Sarah watched, her heart pounding, as the two warriors faced each other. Finally, with obvious reluctance, Chato tossed the cross at her feet and stalked away. Sarah snatched up the cross, clutching it to her chest. She looked up to find Naichi watching her with an unreadable expression. "Your God," he said simply, then walked away. As the days passed, Sarah began to understand more of the camp's dynamics. Naichi was indeed a leader, the son of a chief, respected for his prowess in battle and his strategic mind. But there were divisions within the band. Some, like Chato, favored more aggressive raids and harbored deeper hatred for the whites who continued to encroach on Apache lands. Others seemed weary of the constant warfare, speaking in hushed tones of treaties and reservations. The captives were a point of contention. Sarah learned through observation and fragments of overheard conversation that taking captives was traditional. Women and children were often adopted into the tribe to replace those lost to disease or warfare. But the taking of adult white women was more controversial, especially as it brought increased military retaliation. One morning, Sarah witnessed something that surprised her. A young Apache boy, no more than 7 or 8, fell while climbing the canyon walls and badly scraped his leg. His mother was away gathering plants, and the child sat crying in the dust. Without thinking, Sarah went to him, using the hem of her skirt to clean the wound and speaking soothing words he couldn't understand. The boy's initial fear gave way to curiosity as she worked. She smiled at him, the first genuine smile she had managed since her capture, and he tentatively smiled back. When she finished, he ran off, but not before touching her hand in what seemed like thanks. This small act of kindness did not go unnoticed. Some of the women's looks softened marginally, though Itza's hatred seemed to burn even brighter. Dakeya, the older woman who had first taken charge of her, began to show her tasks with more patience, even correcting her technique rather than simply berating her failures. But it was Naichi's reaction that puzzled her most. She caught him watching her more frequently, his expression thoughtful. Once, when she was struggling with a particularly heavy water jar, he silently took it from her and carried it to its destination, setting it down without a word. These small gestures confused and angered her. She didn't want his help, didn't want anything that might soften her hatred. The nights remained her greatest trial. In the darkness of the wickiup, surrounded by the sounds of a culture not her own, the weight of her losses would crash down upon her. She would think of Thomas, of the life they should have been building together. She would wonder about her father. Had he survived? Did he search for her? The not knowing was its own form of torture. One night, unable to bear the confines of the wickiup, she stepped outside. The desert night was clear, stars brilliant in the absence of any town lights. She found herself at the edge of the camp, looking out at the vast darkness beyond, when she sensed rather than heard someone behind her. "You think of running," Naichi said. It wasn't a question. Sarah didn't turn. "Every moment," she admitted. He moved to stand beside her, his presence both threatening and oddly comforting. "Where you go? No water, no food, no horse. Die in 2 days. maybe less. Maybe that would be better, she said bitterly. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, death is easy. Living is hard. You strong enough for hard? She turned to look at him then. This man who had destroyed her life, yet showed these glimpses of something beyond savagery. Why do you care? He met her gaze steadily. Apache, no loss, no pain. You think we different, but pain. He touched his chest, then gestured to her. Same pain. The moment stretched between them, charged with something Sarah couldn't name. Then voices called from the camp, breaking the spell. Naichi stepped back, the warrior mask sliding back into place. Go back, sleep, tomorrow, more work. As Sarah returned to the wickiup, her mind churned with confusion. She fingered the cross hidden in her clothing, trying to reconcile the brutal raider who had torn her from her wedding with these glimpses of humanity. She thought again of those words that haunted her, but she broke his savage pride and wondered if perhaps the breaking went both ways. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Scouts had spotted army patrols moving through the lower canyons, clearly searching for the raiding party and their captives. The camp erupted in activity, weapons cleaned and prepared, supplies gathered for potential quick movement. Sarah watched it all with a mixture of hope and dread. Rescue might be near, but she had seen what violence brought, and the thought of more bloodshed made her stomach turn. As she worked that day, grinding corn with mechanical movements, she couldn't help but wonder, if the soldiers came, would she even survive the battle? And somewhere, deep in a part of her mind she didn't want to acknowledge, another question whispered, did she want Naichi to survive it too? The desert heat had become a living thing, pressing down upon the camp with suffocating intensity. Sarah's days had fallen into a grueling routine. Dawn brought water hauling, followed by corn grinding, fire tending, and countless other tasks that left her hands cracked and bleeding, her body aching in places she didn't know could hurt. 3 weeks had passed since her capture. Though it felt like 3 years, she had learned to move quietly, to anticipate the needs of the camp before being ordered, to avoid Itza's deliberate cruelties. The Apache women had begun to treat her less like a curiosity and more like what she was, a slave, valuable only for her labor. The small kindnesses from Dakaya continued, usually in the form of extra food when no one was looking or a gesture showing a more efficient way to complete a task. It was during one scorching afternoon, as Sarah struggled to start a cooking fire in the wind, that disaster struck, a sidewinder, hidden in the pile of brush she reached into, struck with lightning speed. The fangs pierced her forearm, and she cried out, jerking back as the snake slithered away into the rocks. The pain was immediate and intense, spreading up her arm like liquid fire. She stared at the 2 puncture marks, already beginning to swell, and felt a cold dread wash over her. She had seen men die from rattlesnake bites, slowly, painfully, their limbs turning black as the poison spread. No! Dakaya's sharp exclamation cut through Sarah's panic. The older woman had seen what happened and moved with surprising speed, grabbing Sarah's arm and examining the wound. She shouted something in Apache, and suddenly the camp was in motion. Sarah's vision began to blur as the venom worked its way through her system. She was vaguely aware of being half-carried, half-dragged to a wickiup. Voices raised in urgent discussion. Her arm felt as if it were on fire, and waves of nausea rolled through her. Through the haze of pain, she saw Naichi push through the gathered crowd. His face, usually so controlled, showed genuine concern as he knelt beside her. He spoke rapidly to an elderly woman Sarah recognized as the band's medicine woman, who began preparing some kind of poultice from her collection of herbs and powders. Stay awake, Naichi commanded, his hand gripping her uninjured arm. Fight! Sarah wanted to laugh at the irony. Here was her captor, the man who had destroyed her life, urging her to live. But she couldn't form words. The poison was spreading, making her limbs feel heavy and strange. The medicine woman worked quickly, cutting the wound to draw out poison, applying the poultice, chanting in a low, rhythmic voice. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between worlds. In her delirium, She saw Thomas's face, heard her father calling her name, felt her mother's cool hand on her fevered brow. But when she opened her eyes, it was Naichi's face she saw, etched with an emotion she couldn't name. He held a water gourd to her lips, supporting her head as she drank. The liquid was bitter with some herb mixed in, but she swallowed obediently, too weak to resist. For 2 days and nights, Sarah hovered between life and death. The fever raged through her body, bringing vivid hallucinations. She spoke in her delirium, calling for Thomas, begging her father's forgiveness, reciting childhood prayers. Through it all, she was aware of a constant presence beside her, of strong hands that held her still when the convulsions came, of a voice speaking words she didn't understand but found oddly comforting. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. Sarah woke to find herself weak but lucid, her arm bandaged but still attached. The swelling reduced to manageable proportions. Sunlight filtered through the wickiup entrance, and she realized she was in Naichi's dwelling, lying on his sleeping furs. He sat nearby, looking haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. When he saw her eyes open and focused, something flickered across his face. "Relief? You live," he said simply. "Why?" Sarah's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Why save me?" He was quiet for a long moment, then stood abruptly. "Rest. Grow strong." He left without answering her question. As Sarah recovered, she noticed a change in how the camp treated her. The women who had previously ignored or tormented her now showed a grudging respect. Even Itza kept her distance, though her eyes still burned with resentment. Sarah learned that surviving a rattlesnake bite was seen as a sign of strength, of favor from the spirits. Dake attended to her during her recovery, bringing broths and checking the healing wound. One day, as she changed the bandages, she spoke in her limited English. "He stay with you, 2 days, 2 nights, no sleep, no leave." She nodded toward the entrance, indicating Naichi. Sarah didn't know what to make of this information. It conflicted with everything she wanted to believe about him, that he was simply a savage who saw her as property. The confusion angered her, and she pushed the thoughts away, focusing instead on regaining her strength. As soon as she could stand without dizziness, she insisted on returning to her duties. The other captive women, those who remained, looked at her with a mixture of awe and hope. Mary Parker whispered that they had thought her dead for certain, that the Apache had been prepared to conduct burial rites. "We have to stay strong," Sarah told her quietly as they worked side by side. "We have to believe we'll get home." But even as she said the words, she wondered if she still believed them herself. Home seemed like something from another lifetime, a dream that grew more distant with each passing day. Her strength returned slowly, and with it came an unexpected development. The young boy she had helped weeks earlier began following her around the camp. His name, she learned, was Taza, and he had decided she was worthy of his attention. He would bring her small gifts, a pretty stone, a hawk feather, a handful of sweet berries, leaving them where she would find them and watching from a distance to see her reaction. One evening, as Sarah sat mending a torn blanket, Taza approached more boldly. He pointed to her healing arm, then to his own leg where she had tended his scrape. "Same," he said in carefully pronounced English, clearly a word someone had taught him. "Despite everything." Sarah found herself smiling. She showed him the needle and thread, and he watched in fascination as she worked. Slowly, carefully, she began teaching him simple English words: needle, thread, blanket. He repeated them solemnly, then taught her the Apache equivalents. This simple exchange did not go unnoticed. Naichi watched from across the camp, his expression unreadable. Later that evening, he approached her as she prepared to sleep. "The boy likes you," he observed. "Children are innocent." Sarah replied carefully, "They don't understand hatred." "No, they learn it." His voice carried a weight of experience. "From us. From you." "I don't hate children," Sarah said firmly. "But you hate Apache." She met his gaze squarely. "I hate what was done to me, to my people." He nodded slowly. "This I understand. Hate is—" He searched for the word. "Familiar." But boy sees different, sees woman who helps, who teaches, who lives when death comes calling. I didn't choose to live, Sarah said bitterly. You chose it for me. Something shifted in his expression. Yes, I choose. He turned to leave, then paused. You think why? Before she could answer, he was gone, leaving her to wrestle with questions she didn't want to contemplate. The next morning brought a reminder of the constant danger they all lived under. A hunting party returned with news of soldiers' tracks, closer than before. The camp immediately went on high alert, with extra sentries posted and escape routes prepared. Sarah watched the preparations with mixed feelings. Part of her hoped desperately for rescue, but she had seen enough to know that any confrontation would be bloody. She thought of Taza, of Dakea, even of the medicine woman who had saved her life. They weren't the faceless savages of campfire stories. They were people, with families and fears of their own. That night, as tensions ran high, Naichi made an unexpected decision. He gathered the captives and spoke to them through one of the warriors who knew more English. Soldiers come maybe soon. If fighting comes, you stay in sacred cave. No harm comes there. Any who breaks sacred space answers to spirits. His eyes moved over each of them, lingering on Sarah. This, I promise. It was more consideration than Sarah had expected, and she saw her own confusion reflected in the other women's faces. Was this mercy, strategy, or something else entirely? As the captives were led back to their quarters, Sarah found herself walking beside Naichi, without planning to. She spoke, "Thank you for protecting us." He glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features. "You thank enemy? I thank the man who saved my life," she said quietly. "Even if I don't understand why." They walked in silence for a moment before he responded. "Apache way says captive becomes Apache or dies. You choose neither. You stay yourself, but live. This is new thing, strong thing. Is that why you saved me? Because I'm stubborn?" The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe, or maybe," he stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "Maybe because when you look at me, you see savage, but also you see man. Both true. This white people don't often see." The moment stretched between them, charged with an understanding neither wanted to acknowledge. Then voices called out, sentries reporting movement in the distance, and the spell was broken. Naichi became the warrior chief again, striding away to deal with a potential threat. Sarah stood alone in the darkness, her hand unconsciously moving to her healing arm. She thought of the words that haunted her dreams, but she broke his savage pride, and wondered if perhaps the breaking had already begun, not through force or defiance, but through something far more dangerous, understanding. As she made her way back to the wickiup, she whispered a prayer, not just for her own safety or rescue anymore, but for wisdom to navigate the increasingly complex path before her. The desert wind carried her words away into the vast night, where soldiers and Apache and fate itself waited to play out whatever came next. The morning sun had barely crested the canyon walls when Sarah heard the commotion. She was drawing water from the stream, her daily ritual that had become almost meditative, when angry voices shattered the peace. Looking up, she saw a group of warriors dragging someone toward the center of camp, another captive, by the looks of her torn blue dress and tangled blonde hair. As Sarah hurried closer, she recognized her with a shock. Elizabeth Thornton, the mayor's daughter from Cedar Ridge. They had never been friends. Elizabeth's family considered themselves above associating with newcomers like the Morrisons. But seeing her now, wild-eyed and fighting against her captors, Sarah felt only compassion. The warriors threw Elizabeth to the ground in front of Naichi's wickiup. She scrambled to her knees, her voice rising in a mixture of threats and pleas. "My father will pay. He'll bring the whole army down on you savages. Let me go." Sarah watched Naichi emerge, his face impassive as he surveyed the scene. His eyes found hers across the crowd, and something passed between them. A question, perhaps, or a challenge. "Another one for work." Chato sneered in his broken English, giving Elizabeth a rough shove. Maybe this one not so proud after a few days. No? Sarah stepped forward before she could think better of it. I'll take responsibility for her. Teach her what she needs to know. The crowd grew quiet. It was unprecedented for a captive to speak up this way, to insert herself into tribal decisions. Chato's face darkened with anger, but Sarah kept her eyes on Naichi. You speak for her? Naichi asked, his voice carefully neutral. She's from my town. I know her. Sarah lifted her chin. She'll die if she fights. You know this. Let me help her adjust. Itza pushed forward, speaking rapid Apache, clearly objecting. Others joined in, and soon heated arguments flew back and forth. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she grasped the underlying tension. Her speaking up had challenged the established order. Naichi raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, it was in Apache first, then in English for the captive's benefit. Sarah Morrison speaks. She has earned right, survived snakebite, works hard, causes no trouble. His dark eyes fixed on her. You take responsibility. You share punishment if she makes problems. Agreed? Sarah's mouth went dry, but she nodded. Agreed. Then it is decided. He turned and walked away, effectively ending the discussion. Sarah helped Elizabeth to her feet, feeling the weight of many eyes upon them. Come with me, she said quietly. And for God's sake, stop fighting them. Sarah? Elizabeth's voice was hoarse with disbelief. Sarah Morrison, but you. They said you were dead. Not yet, Sarah said grimly, leading her away from the crowd. Though you'll wish you were if you keep antagonizing them. First rule, keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. Over the next days, Sarah found herself in the strange position of teaching Elizabeth how to survive, the mayor's daughter, who had never done a day's hard labor in her life, was woefully unprepared for the reality of captive life. Her soft hands blistered immediately from carrying water jugs. She couldn't stomach the unfamiliar food. She cried constantly, alternating between despair and rage. I can't do this, Elizabeth sobbed one evening, her hands bloody from grinding corn. I'm not strong like you. Sarah looked at her own hands, scarred and calloused now, and almost laughed. I wasn't strong either. You learn or you die. Those are the only choices. But how can you stand it? How can you just accept this? I don't accept it, Sarah said firmly. I survive it. There's a difference. Teaching Elizabeth forced Sarah to examine her own adaptation. When had she stopped flinching at the sound of Apache words? When had the rhythm of camp life become familiar? She still prayed each night, still clutched her hidden cross, but she also found herself unconsciously mimicking the efficient movements of the Apache women, understanding their gestures, if not their words. The tension came to a head one afternoon when Elizabeth, exhausted and frustrated, threw down the heavy grinding stone and screamed at Dakea, who had been trying to show her a better technique. I won't do this anymore. I'm not a slave. My father— The slap came from Itza, who had been waiting for just such an opportunity. Elizabeth fell to the ground, and Itza stood over her, speaking in rapid Apache, her meaning clear even without translation. Sarah moved between them. No, she said firmly. She's my responsibility. Itza's eyes flashed dangerously. She spoke again, and this time, Sarah caught one word she had learned, the Apache term for challenge. The crowd gathered quickly, sensing conflict. Sarah's heart pounded, but she held her ground. She had seen enough of camp dynamics to know that backing down now would make both her and Elizabeth targets for worse treatment. You want to fight me? Sarah asked, surprising herself with her steady voice. Fine, but it solves nothing. Naichi appeared at the edge of the crowd, but he didn't intervene. This was between the women, and Apache custom apparently demanded he let it play out. Itza lunged first, and Sarah met her halfway. They grappled in the dust, a vicious tangle of hands and nails and fury. Sarah fought not with technique but with desperation, knowing that losing would mean more than bruises. She thought of Elizabeth, helpless and terrified, and found strength she didn't know she possessed. The fight ended when Sarah managed to pin Itza, her forearm pressed against the Apache woman's throat. They stared at each other, both breathing hard, and Sarah saw something shift in Itza's eyes. Not friendship, never that, but perhaps a grudging acknowledgement. Enough. Naichi's voice cut through the crowd's murmurs. It is settled. Sarah helped Itza to her feet, and they stood facing each other for a moment. Then Itza spat in the dust and walked away. But the persecution lessened after that day. That evening, as Sarah tended her own scratches and bruises, Naichi came to her. You fight for another. This is Apache way. She would have died, Sarah said simply. Many die. Why save her? Sarah considered the question. Because I can, because maintaining our humanity is the only victory we have here. He studied her with those penetrating eyes. You speak of humanity. You think Apache not human? I think... Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. I think humanity isn't about where we're born or what language we speak. It's about choices, the choice to help or harm, to show mercy or cruelty. And which do I choose? His voice was soft, dangerous. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Both. That's what makes you human. He was silent for a long moment, then spoke in a voice so low she had to strain to hear. Stay away from me. The words seemed torn from him against his will, but even as he spoke them, he stepped closer, and Sarah found herself unable to move. The air between them crackled with tension that had nothing to do with captivity or culture, and everything to do with the primal recognition between a man and a woman. Stay away, he repeated, but his hand rose to touch her face, his thumb tracing the scratch Itza had left on her cheek. Sarah's breath caught. She should pull away, should maintain the hatred that kept her safe. Instead, she heard herself whisper, I can't. The admission hung between them like a confession. Then voices called from the camp scouts returning with news, and Naichi stepped back abruptly. You must, he said roughly, and strode away. Sarah stood alone, her heart racing, her skin still burning where he had touched her. She pressed her hands to her face, trying to understand what had just happened. This was wrong, impossible. He was her captor, her enemy. He had destroyed her life, taken everything from her. But the warrior who had stayed by her side through the snakebite fever, who had protected the captives from worse treatment, who looked at her with such complexity in his dark eyes, was he the same man who had torn her from her wedding day? Elizabeth found her there, still shaken. Sarah, are you all right? I saw the fight. Sarah forced herself to focus. I'm fine, but you need to understand something. Elizabeth, the rules are different here. Pride will get you killed. How do you do it? Elizabeth asked desperately. How do you not go mad? Sarah thought of Naichi's touch, of the dangerous softening she felt toward him, of the way her resolve seemed to crumble a little more each day. Maybe I am going mad, she admitted quietly. That night, as the camp settled into sleep, Sarah lay awake wrestling with truths she didn't want to face. She was changing, adapting in ways that went beyond mere survival. The Apache life was hard, but not without its own rhythms and reasons. The children's laughter was the same as any children's. The women's gossip around the grinding stones reminded her of quilting circles back home. Even the warriors, for all their fierceness, showed tenderness to their families, and Naichi was breaking down her defenses as surely as the desert sun bleached the color from her salvaged dress. She thought of his warning to stay away and recognized it for what it was, not a command born of cruelty, but of his own internal struggle. But she broke his savage pride. Sarah whispered to the darkness and wondered if perhaps they were breaking each other, piece by piece, until neither would recognize themselves when it was done. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of will and endurance. The soldiers still searched. Elizabeth still needed protection, and the complex web of camp politics required constant navigation. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, Sarah allowed herself one moment of dangerous truth when Naichi had touched her face, when he had said he couldn't stay away. She had felt more alive than she had since watching Thomas fall on the church steps. The guilt of that admission would torment her come morning. But for now, she closed her eyes and let herself remember the warmth of his hand, even as she clutched her mother's cross and prayed for forgiveness for the betrayal of her own heart. The child's fever had raged for 2 days. Little Ayanna, daughter of one of the warriors, lay listless in her mother's arms, her small body burning with heat that the medicine woman's herbs couldn't break. Sarah watched from across the camp as the women gathered, their usual stoicism cracking to reveal the universal fear of mothers everywhere. She had been grinding corn when the commotion started, but something in the child's labored breathing drew her closer. The mother, a young woman named Kosheda, looked up with desperate eyes as Sarah approached. They had never spoken. Kosheda had been among those who treated the captives with cold indifference. But now all Sarah saw was a terrified parent. "Please," Kosheda said in broken English. "You know white medicine?" Sarah's medical knowledge was limited to what her mother had taught her. Basic remedies. How to cool a fever, how to recognize serious illness. But looking at the child, she recognized symptoms she had seen before. "It might be pneumonia," she said slowly. "The rattling breath, the fever." The medicine woman, Salali, spoke sharply in Apache, clearly dismissing the white woman's opinion. But Kosheda clutched at Sarah's arm. "What do? What white mothers do?" Sarah thought quickly. "We need to cool her fever first. Cold water compresses. And prop her up. She needs to breathe easier. The fluid in her lungs," she demonstrated, showing how to position the child. Salali objected vehemently, and an argument broke out among the women. Traditional ways versus foreign knowledge. It was a battle as old as the frontier itself. Sarah found herself in the middle, trying to explain through gestures and broken communication why the child needed to be upright, why the fever had to be controlled. It was Dakea who broke the deadlock. The older woman had been watching silently, but now she spoke with authority, gesturing between Sarah and the sick child. Though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the meaning became clear when Dakea began organizing the women to follow Sarah's suggestions. For the next hours, Sarah worked alongside the Apache women, showing them how to rotate cool compresses, how to drip water into the child's mouth to keep her hydrated. She mixed what remedies she could from the available herbs, drawing on half-remembered recipes from her mother's journal. Elizabeth helped, fetching water and preparing cloths, her own troubles forgotten in the face of the child's crisis. As night fell, Naichi appeared. He surveyed the scene, captive white women working alongside Apache mothers, traditional barriers temporarily dissolved by necessity. His eyes found Sarah's, and she saw something shift in his expression. "The child?" he asked quietly. "Fighting," Sarah replied, not pausing in her work. "The fever's breaking, I think, but she's so weak." He knelt beside Kosheda, speaking softly in Apache. The young mother's tears flowed freely as she responded, and Naichi's hand briefly touched the child's burning forehead. It was such a human gesture, so at odds with the fierce warrior image, that Sarah's heart constricted. Through the long night, they maintained their vigil. Sarah dozed fitfully between treatments, always waking to check the child's breathing. Once, she found Naichi had taken over the compress duty, his strong hands surprisingly gentle as he cooled the little girl's fever. "You care for her," Sarah observed softly, not wanting to wake the others. "She is my cousin's daughter," he replied. "But even if not family, she is Apache. We protect our own. All children deserve protection," Sarah said, thinking of young Taza, of all the innocent lives caught in the endless conflict between their peoples. Yes, his agreement was simple but seemed to carry weight. "This is why." He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Why what?" He was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, why things must change, why old ways of raiding, of taking, of revenge. They bring only more death, more children sick, more mothers crying. Sarah stared at him, stunned by this admission. "But you still raid? You still take captives? I follow my father's path, my people's needs." His voice was bitter. "But each year, fewer return. Each year, more soldiers come. We fight ghosts of tomorrow while our children suffer today. Before Sarah could respond, Ayanna stirred, whimpering. Her fever had finally broken, sweat beading on her small forehead. Kosheta woke instantly, crying out in relief as she felt her daughter's cooler skin. The camp erupted in quiet celebration. Women who had maintained vigil through the night embraced each other, and even stern Salali nodded approval at Sarah. As dawn broke over the canyon, painting the rocks in shades of gold and rose, Ayanna opened her eyes and asked for water in a weak but clear voice. Kosheta clutched Sarah's hands, tears streaming down her face. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and Dakea translated. She says you have gift, says white medicine saved her daughter when Apache medicine failed. She is in your debt. No, Sarah said firmly. We worked together. Both medicines, both ways. That's what saved her. This diplomatic answer pleased the women, and Sarah found herself suddenly accepted in a way she hadn't been before. As she and Elizabeth finally returned to their quarters, exhausted but relieved, Elizabeth marveled. They're looking at you differently now. They're mothers. Sarah said simply, I helped a child, that's universal. But it was more than that, and they both knew it. Sarah had crossed a line, had invested emotionally in the welfare of her captor's children. The simple act of caring for Ayanna had shifted something fundamental in her relationship with the camp. Over the following days, this shift became more apparent. Women who had previously ignored her now nodded in greeting. Some even began teaching her Apache words, pointing to objects and patiently correcting her pronunciation. Kosheta brought her small gifts, a beaded hair tie, a perfectly round stone from the river, fresh berries from her gathering. Even more significantly, Sarah found herself genuinely reciprocating these gestures. When Dakea's arthritis flared, Sarah prepared a willow bark tea without being asked. She played simple games with the children who increasingly sought her out, delighting in their laughter. She began to see the camp not as a prison, but as a community, harsh and foreign. Yes, but bound by the same hopes and fears as any other. This growing connection did not go unnoticed. Chato and his faction watched with obvious displeasure, muttering about corruption of Apache ways. But others, particularly the women, seemed to welcome this bridge between worlds. One afternoon, as Sarah helped Kosheta weave baskets, a skill she was slowly acquiring, Naichi approached. The women fell silent, but he gestured for them to continue. Kosheta says you refuse her gifts of gratitude. He said to Sarah, I did what anyone would do. Sarah replied, concentrating on the intricate weaving pattern to avoid his gaze. Being near him had become increasingly difficult since their charged encounter. No, not anyone. He was quiet for a moment. Apache have saying, enemy who saves child becomes family. Sarah's hand stilled. I'm not Apache. No, but you are not enemy either. Not anymore. The words hung in the air between them. Kosheta watched with knowing eyes, and Sarah realized that others had noticed the tension between her and Naichi. In a camp where little remained private, their careful avoidance of each other had likely sparked its own gossip. I should go, Sarah said, standing abruptly. Elizabeth needs... Stay. It wasn't a command, but a request. Kosheta wishes to teach you her grandmother's pattern. It is honor. Sarah sank back down, understanding the significance. These patterns were family treasures, passed down through generations. To be taught one was to be accepted at a level that transcended mere tolerance. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the work, the quiet chatter of the women, oddly soothing. When Taza ran up to show her a lizard he'd caught, she admired it with appropriate enthusiasm. When one of the women made a joke in Apache that she couldn't understand, she laughed anyway, caught up in their mirth. For a moment, just a moment, she forgot she was a captive. The spell was broken when a commotion arose from the camp entrance. Warriors were returning from a hunt, but their demeanor spoke of more than successful foraging. Sarah watched Naichi stride to meet them, his relaxed posture immediately shifting to alertness. The news, when it filtered through the camp, sent a chill through Sarah's newfound peace. Soldiers had been spotted just 2 valleys over, a large contingent with Apache scouts. They were systematically searching every canyon, every possible hiding place. That night, as the camp prepared for possible evacuation, Sarah found herself torn between hope and dread. Rescue was near, she should be elated. But looking around at the people who had become familiar, at children like Taza and Ayana, at women who had become almost friends, she felt an unexpected grief. "You're troubled," Elizabeth observed as they packed what few possessions they had acquired. Sarah nodded, unable to articulate the confusion in her heart. How could she explain that she both yearned for rescue and feared it? That the thought of soldiers storming this camp, of violence erupting in this place where children played, made her sick, as if summoned by her thoughts. Nietzsche appeared in the doorway of their shelter. "Come," he said quietly. "Both of you." He led them to a natural cave formation hidden behind a fall of rocks. Inside, they found the other captives already assembled, along with supplies and water. "If fighting comes, you stay here," he instructed. "No matter what you hear, warriors know this place is forbidden. You will be safe." "And if the soldiers win?" Elizabeth asked boldly. "Do we call out to them?" Nietzsche's eyes found Sarah's in the dim light. "That is your choice, but know this, if soldiers come, many will die. Apache will not surrender easily. Women, children." He didn't finish, but the implication was clear. After he left, the captives huddled together in the cave, each lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself praying, not just for rescue anymore, but for wisdom, for a path through this that didn't end in bloodshed. As darkness fell completely, she thought she heard something, drums, perhaps, or singing, the Apache preparing for battle in their own way. She thought of Nietzsche, of the conflict she had seen in him between duty and conscience. She thought of Cocheta and Ayana, of Dakea and even difficult Salali. "But she broke his savage pride," Sarah whispered to herself. But the words had taken on new meaning. It wasn't about conquest or defiance anymore. It was about something far more complex, the breaking down of barriers, of preconceptions, of the simple narratives that made enemies of strangers. Tomorrow might bring rescue or tragedy or both, but tonight, in this cave that smelled of earth and ancient stone, Sarah Morrison grappled with a truth that would have horrified her just weeks ago. She no longer knew which outcome to hope for. The dawn brought chaos. Sarah woke to the sound of rifle fire echoing through the canyon, the sharp reports bouncing off the rock walls until it seemed the very earth was under assault. In the cave, the captive women huddled together, Elizabeth gripping Sarah's hand so tightly her nails drew blood. "They're here," Mary Parker whispered, her voice a mixture of hope and terror. "The soldiers are here." Through a crack in the rocks, Sarah could see portions of the camp. Warriors ran past, weapons in hand, their war cries mixing with the shouts of soldiers. Smoke began to rise from several points, whether from gunfire or deliberately set blazes. She couldn't tell. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was perhaps only 30 minutes. The Apache knew their terrain, using every rock and crevice for cover, but the soldiers had numbers and firepower. Sarah watched in horror as bodies fell on both sides, the dust turning dark with blood. Then she saw him. Nietzsche moved through the battle like a force of nature, directing his warriors, his rifles speaking death to any soldier who ventured too close to the heart of the camp. Even in the midst of violence, she couldn't deny his terrible grace, the way he seemed to dance between bullets. A movement caught her eye. Cocheta running with Ayana in her arms, trying to reach the safety of the caves where the children had been gathered. A soldier appeared in her path, rifle raised, without thinking. Sarah screamed a warning, though she knew it couldn't be heard over the battle's din. Nietzsche appeared as if from nowhere, tackling the soldier before he could fire. They rolled in the dust, grappling for the weapon. Sarah watched, her heart in her throat. As they fought, the soldier was younger, fresher, But Naichi fought with the desperation of a man protecting his own. "We should signal them," Elizabeth said urgently. "The soldiers! We should let them know we're here." "No," Sarah said firmly. "Naichi said to stay hidden. If we reveal ourselves now, in the middle of the battle, he's our captor." Elizabeth turned on her with wild eyes. "Have you forgotten that? Have you forgotten Thomas, your father, everything they took from us?" Sarah had no answer. She hadn't forgotten. The pain was still there, raw and real. But watching the battle unfold, seeing Apache women and children fleeing alongside the warriors' desperate defense, the lines had blurred beyond recognition. The tide turned when Apache scouts with the soldiers managed to flank the defenders. Sarah recognized the tactic, using the people's own knowledge against them. It was effective and heartbreaking. The warriors began falling back, trying to give their families time to escape through hidden passes. Through it all, Sarah watched for Naichi, catching glimpses of him as he fought a retreating action. His rifle was long empty, and he fought with knife and war club, every movement speaking of exhausted desperation. Then she saw Chato fall, a soldier's bullet finding its mark. Despite everything, despite his cruelty and hatred, he died trying to protect a group of elderly women making their slow escape. It was a reminder that even the worst among them had their own forms of honor. The fighting was moving closer to their cave. Sarah could hear soldiers calling to each other in English. So strange after weeks of Apache voices. One voice rose above the others, a captain by the sound of it, ordering his men to search every crevice for captives and hostiles. "Now," Elizabeth said. "We have to call out now." But before anyone could act, Naichi appeared at the cave entrance. He was wounded, blood streaming from a gash on his shoulder, his face painted with dirt and gore. His eyes found Sarah's immediately. "Come," he said urgently. "Not safe here anymore." "Are you insane?" Elizabeth shrieked. "We're not going anywhere with you." Naichi ignored her, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. "Soldiers kill everyone they find. Apache, white women in battle, no difference. Hidden path leads away. You choose stay and risk soldiers' bullets, or come." Sarah understood what he wasn't saying. If they were found with the Apache, even as captives, the soldiers might not ask questions before shooting. But if they fled with him, they would be choosing to remain captives. "I'm staying," Elizabeth declared. "I'll take my chances with my own people." Mary Parker nodded agreement, as did the other two captive women. But Sarah hesitated, torn between worlds. She thought of Taza, of little Ayana, of the women who had become almost friends. She thought of the complex man before her, wounded and desperate, but still thinking of their safety. "Sarah," Elizabeth grabbed her arm, "you can't actually be considering—" A burst of gunfire, terrifyingly close, cut her off. Voices shouted just outside. Soldiers, moving toward their position. Naichi stepped back, preparing to leave, to continue his flight, but his eyes remained on Sarah. A question and a plea combined. Time seemed to slow. Sarah stood at the crossroads of two worlds, two futures. Stay and be rescued. Return to a life that would never be the same, always carrying the weight of these weeks. Or go and step fully into a world she had only glimpsed, with all its dangers and possibilities. "I'm sorry," she whispered to Elizabeth, though she wasn't sure for what she was apologizing. Then she stepped toward Naichi. "Show me the path." "Sarah, no!" Elizabeth's cry followed her as Naichi grabbed her hand and pulled her deeper into the cave. Behind them, she could hear the other women beginning to call out to the soldiers, their voices high with relief and desperation. The hidden path was a narrow crevice that required them to move sideways in places. Sarah's dress caught and tore, and she could feel Naichi's blood where his hand gripped hers. They emerged on the far side of the canyon, where a small group of Apache had gathered, mostly women and children, a few wounded warriors. Dakea was there, supporting Salali, who had taken a bullet in the leg. Kocheta clutched Ayana, both of them wide-eyed with terror. And Taza, brave little Taza, stood with a knife in his hand, trying to look fierce despite the tears streaming down his face. "Why?" Naichi asked Sarah quietly, as they paused to catch their breath. "Why choose this?" Sarah looked back toward the canyon where the sounds of battle were dying down, replaced by the victorious shouts of soldiers. She thought of all the reasons. The children who deserved protection, the complicated feelings she had developed, the growing understanding that right and wrong weren't as simple as she'd once believed. But in the end, she gave the simplest truth, because you asked me to choose, really choose, not as a captive, but as myself. And this, she gestured to the frightened group around them. This feels like what my mother would have done, what the woman I want to be would do. Nietzsche's expression underwent a profound change. The warrior's mask cracked completely, revealing a vulnerability that took her breath away. "You humble me," he said in Apache, and though she didn't understand the words, she felt their weight. They had to move quickly. The soldiers would soon discover the escape route. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah helped Cocheta with Ayana, supported Dakea when she stumbled, became fully part of this remnant fleeing into an uncertain future. Hours later, when they finally stopped in a high valley where a hidden spring provided water, the full weight of her decision settled upon her. She had chosen to remain with the Apache, had turned her back on rescue. Elizabeth would tell everyone she had lost her mind, had been corrupted by her captors. Perhaps she had. But watching Nietzsche tend to his people's wounds with gentle hands, seeing the gratitude in Cocheta's eyes, feeling Taza's small hand slip into hers seeking comfort, Sarah knew she had made the only choice her conscience would allow. As the sun set on this day of violence and decision, Nietzsche approached her. His shoulder had been bandaged, but pain etched lines around his eyes. "The soldiers will keep searching," he said. "Life will be harder now. Always running, always hiding. You could still go back. I would take you to a place where they could find you." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "You once asked me if I was strong enough for the hard path. I am." Something passed between them then, an understanding that transcended captor and captive, Apache and white, man and woman. They were simply two people who had found something worth protecting in each other, despite all the reasons they shouldn't. "Your pride," Sarah said softly, remembering the words that had haunted her. "I think I understand now. It wasn't about breaking you. It was about both of us breaking free from what we thought we knew." Nietzsche reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face as he had once before. This time, she leaned into his touch, accepting what it meant, what it promised. "My people will not all accept this," he warned. "You will always be different." "I know," Sarah said, "but different doesn't mean wrong." As darkness fell and the small band prepared for a cold night without fires that might give away their position, Sarah Morrison sat between two worlds. Behind her lay everything she had known: safety, certainty, the life she had planned. Ahead lay uncertainty, hardship, and a love that defied every boundary her society held dear. She had made her choice. Now she would live it, with all its consequences and possibilities. And as Nietzsche's hand found hers in the darkness, a silent promise of protection and partnership, she knew that sometimes the hardest choices led to the most profound freedoms. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but Sarah found comfort in their constancy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, but tonight, she was exactly where she chose to be. 6 months had passed since that fateful day in the canyon. Sarah stood at the edge of the settlement, no longer Cedar Ridge, which had grown and fortified since the raid, but the neighboring town of Silver Creek. Her hair, once carefully pinned in Eastern fashion, now hung in a simple braid. Her skin bore the deep tan of desert living, and her hands, though still bearing the calluses of hard work, had healed from their worst abuses. She wore a simple calico dress, neither fully Eastern nor Western in style, but something in between, much like herself. Around her neck, barely visible beneath her collar, hung 2 items on a leather cord: her mother's silver cross and a small turquoise stone that Nietzsche had given her the day she left. The decision to return had been agonizing. After months of living with the remnant band, constantly moving, always watching for soldiers, Naichi had made it for her. The army's pressure was relentless, and worse. Bounties had been placed on Apache heads. Every day brought new dangers, and Sarah's presence, a white woman clearly staying by choice, only inflamed the situation. "You must go back," he had told her one star-filled night. "Not because I wish it, but because it is the only way you survive, the only way we all survive." She had fought him, had raged and wept and pleaded, but in the end, she had seen the wisdom and the pain in his decision. Her presence put everyone at risk. The children she had come to love, the women who had become her sisters in all but blood, they were all in greater danger because of her. The leaving had been brutal. Kosheda had wept, pressing a beautifully woven basket into Sarah's hands. Dakea had embraced her, whispering blessings in Apache. And Taza, brave little Taza, had tried so hard not to cry, giving her a perfectly round river stone for remembering. Naichi had taken her to within sight of an army patrol, far from where the band was hiding. Their parting was wordless. Everything had been said in the days leading up to it, but his eyes had spoken volumes, and the turquoise stone he pressed into her palm carried the weight of promises that could never be spoken aloud. Now, standing in Silver Creek, Sarah faced the consequences of her choices. Word had spread quickly of her return, the woman who had chosen to stay with the Apache, who had refused to rescue. Some called her touched in the head, others whispered worse things. The only reason she hadn't been completely shunned was the protection of an unexpected ally. Margaret Thornton, Elizabeth's mother, had taken Sarah under her wing. When Elizabeth had returned with tales of Sarah's choice, Margaret had done something unexpected. She had listened, had asked questions, had tried to understand. And when Sarah finally appeared at the edge of town, weathered and forever changed, Margaret had been the first to offer shelter. "My daughter lives because of you," Margaret had said simply. "You taught her to survive when I couldn't. Whatever choices you made after, I owe you her life." It was Margaret who had helped Sarah navigate the complex return to white society. The army had questioned her extensively, suspicious of her voluntary stay with the Apache. They wanted information about locations, numbers, plans. Sarah had given them nothing, claiming trauma and confused memories. They didn't believe her, but they couldn't prove otherwise. The townspeople were divided. Some saw her as a traitor, others as a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. Though they didn't use that term, a few, like Margaret, saw her as something more complex, a woman who had faced impossible choices and survived. Sarah found work as a seamstress, her fingers remembering the skills even as they missed the feel of weaving baskets. She rented a small room above the general store, a space that felt both confining and exposed after months under open skies. At night, she would hold Taza's stone and Naichi's turquoise, and remember. The hardest part was the stories. The Apache were painted as pure savages in every telling, their raids discussed with no context of the provocations, the broken treaties, the gradual theft of their lands. Sarah bit her tongue when people spoke of the merciless heathens, remembering Kocheda's gentle hands, Dakea's wisdom, Naichi's complex honor. One day, while shopping for thread, she overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. A group of men were discussing a new military campaign, boasting about how they would clean out every last Apache nest in the territory. "Heard they got a beat on that war chief Naichi," one man said. "The one who took those women from Cedar Ridge. They say he's holed up in the Dragoon Mountains with what's left of his band." Sarah's hands trembled as she paid for her purchases. That night, she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She began to write. Not letters. Those would be intercepted. Instead, she wrote stories. Stories for the Eastern newspapers that were hungry for Wild West tales. But her stories were different. They told of Apache mothers caring for sick children, of warriors defending their shrinking homeland, of a culture rich in tradition and honor facing extinction. She wrote under a pseudonym S.E. Morrison and was careful to change details, to obscure locations and identities. But the heart of truth beat in every word. To her surprise, the stories found an audience. Letters came from readers back east, expressing sympathy for the Apache plight, questioning the official narratives. Margaret became her secret ally, helping to mail the stories through contacts in other towns. "You're playing a dangerous game," she warned. "If people here knew, they need to know the truth." Sarah insisted, "Someone needs to tell it." Months passed. Sarah's stories gained wider circulation. She heard whispers that some in Washington were beginning to question the harsh policies toward the Apache, though change was glacial. In Silver Creek, she remained an oddity, the woman who had lived with the savages and returned not quite right. She never spoke of Nietzsche to anyone, but she felt his absence like a physical ache. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of a tall man with long dark hair, and her heart would race, only to fall when she saw a stranger's face. The turquoise stone never left her neck. Then, one evening as she sat writing by lamplight, she heard a soft knock at her door. This was unusual. She had few visitors. Opening it cautiously, she found a young Apache woman she didn't recognize, dressed in the clothes of a Mexican peasant. The woman spoke quickly in accented English. "Nietzsche sends word. He lives. The children you knew live. They have found sanctuary across the border. He says—" She paused, as if remembering exact words. "He says the savage pride is gone, replaced by something better. He says you were right. Humanity's about choices." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. "Is he? Are they safe?" "For now. Always moving, but alive." The woman pressed something into Sarah's hand, a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. "He said give you this, said you would understand." Then she was gone, melting back into the shadows before Sarah could ask more. With shaking hands, Sarah unwrapped the bundle. Inside was a photograph, a rare treasure, showing a group of Apache in Mexican territory. She could make out Cocheta and Ayana, Dakea looking older but still strong. And there, standing apart but clearly in a position of leadership, was Nietzsche. But it was what else the bundle contained that made her sink to her knees. A letter, written in the careful English she had helped teach him. "Sarah, the world changes. We change with it or die. You taught me this. Your stories reach even here. They give our children hope that someday understanding will come. I think of you when the stars are bright. The pride you broke was false, built on hate and fear. What remains is true, built on hope for tomorrow. Live well, teach others. Maybe someday the world will be ready for what we almost had. N." Sarah held the letter to her chest and wept, for what was lost, for what was preserved, for the impossible love that transcended every boundary their world insisted upon. When her tears were spent, she rose and returned to her desk. There were more stories to tell, more truths to share. Outside her window, Silver Creek went about its evening routines, unaware that in a small room above the general store, a woman was carefully building bridges between worlds with nothing but words and memories. The townspeople would continue to whisper about Sarah Morrison, the woman who chose to stay with the Apache and came back changed. They would never know the full truth, but somewhere in Mexico, a band of Apache would survive another day, and their stories would not die unheard. And sometimes, when the desert wind blew just right, Sarah would swear she could hear the echo of drums and remember a time when she stood between two worlds and chose love over fear, understanding over hatred. She picked up her pen and began to write. The Apache warrior took the bride as spoils, but she broke his savage pride. Yet in that breaking, both found something neither expected, their shared humanity. The stars wheeled overhead, witnesses to all the stories told and untold, as Sarah Morrison continued her quiet revolution, one word at a time. Thank you for listening to this story from the Wild West. I hope this tale of love, survival, and understanding touched your heart as much as it did mine. Where are you listening from today? Please comment below and let's connect across the miles, just as Sarah and Nietzsche connected across cultures. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic stories from America's frontier. And share your thoughts about Sarah's incredible journey. What would you have chosen in her place? Your comments and perspectives make these stories come alive for our entire community.